The first thing everyone got wrong about the German Shepherd was this. He was not trying to hurt anyone. He was trying to save someone. The rain came sideways across the parking lot outside the Bayswater Animal Rescue, cold enough to sting the skin even through a thick jacket. Water rattled against the corrugated metal roof in uneven bursts while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like tired insects refusing to die. Somewhere down the hallway, a metal gate slammed shut. Then the barking split the hallway open. Not normal barking. Not fear. Not aggression. A warning. Sharp. Rhythmic. Almost human. Staff hurried past reception carrying towels and paperwork, speaking in tense whispers that disappeared beneath the storm. A young volunteer near the coffee machine shook her head nervously. "That shepherd's gone mad," she muttered. Nearly smashed his skull into the glass trying to get at a family. But the older woman beside her didn't answer. She just stared toward Kennel 7 with pale, worried eyes. Because deep down, everyone in the shelter knew something felt wrong tonight. His name was Ash. 4 years old. Male German Shepherd. Sable coat dark as wet ash timber after a bushfire. Broad chest. Amber eyes. One torn ear that never stood fully upright again. According to the intake report, he'd been found wandering near an abandoned freight depot outside Geelong 6 months earlier, soaked in rainwater and engine oil, half-starved, refusing to let police near a locked storage shed. Nobody understood why. Nobody understood much about Ash at all. Families tried adopting him twice. Both times ended the same way. Comfort days. Gentle even. Then suddenly the dog would freeze, stare at somebody in complete silence, and erupt into violent panic if they came too close. No bites. No injuries. Just terror. As though the dog could smell something nobody else could. Shelter staff stopped trying to explain it. It was easier to label him unstable than admit a dog might be seeing what people refused to see. Tonight had been the worst incident yet. A woman carrying a little boy had just stepped toward the front exit when Ash launched himself against the kennel glass hard enough to crack the lower corner. Blood streaked faintly across the pane where his muzzle struck. The little boy burst into tears. The mother screamed. And standing beside them the entire time had been a tall man in a gray raincoat no one remembered seeing enter the building. By the time staff rushed over, the man was gone. Only Ash kept barking. Over and over. Like he was trying to chase a ghost no one else could see. 30 minutes later, the shelter doors opened again with a hollow groan against the wind. Ethan Walker stepped inside carrying the smell of rain, eucalyptus, and damp wool. 37 years old. Former military K-9 handler. Australian-born. Broad shoulders worn slightly lower these days from too many sleepless nights. His dark hair was clipped short but untidy around the edges, and rainwater still clung to the stubble along his jaw. A faded tattoo of a German Shepherd covered most of his right forearm, disappearing beneath the sleeve of his jacket whenever he flexed his hand. He looked like the kind of man who preferred silence over conversation. The kind who carried grief carefully so nobody else had to touch it. The receptionist glanced up. "We're closing soon, sir." Ethan nodded once. Just wanted to look around. Looking to adopt? He hesitated. Not sure yet. That was the truth. He hadn't come for a dog. Not really. The small apartment in Footscray felt too quiet lately, that was all. Too many nights waking to phantom sounds that weren't there anymore. Boots on gravel. Radio chatter. The low breathing of a military dog sleeping beside his bunk 10 years ago in Kandahar. Some absences never stopped echoing. Another bark thundered through the shelter. Deep. Raw. Ethan's eyes shifted instantly toward the hallway. Every muscle in his body tightened before his brain even caught up. Not fear. Recognition. The receptionist sighed tiredly. "That's Ash. Don't get too close. He's been carrying on all afternoon." But Ethan was already walking. Slow. Careful. The barking grew louder with every step down the corridor. Metal cages lined both sides beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Dogs paced nervously inside blankets and shadows. Yet halfway down the hall, Ethan noticed something strange. Every kennel was reacting to the noise except one. Ash wasn't barking anymore. He was standing perfectly still. The German Shepherd faced the end of the corridor without moving a muscle. Rain tapped softly against the high windows overhead, while fluorescent light reflected in the dog's amber eyes. Ethan followed his stare. Empty hallway. Closed exit door. Nothing else. Then Ash slowly turned his head toward Ethan's right arm. Toward the tattoo. And for the first time all night, the dog stopped growling. The hallway smelled of wet concrete, antiseptic, and old dog blankets that never fully dried during winter. Somewhere beyond the kennels, thunder rolled low across Melbourne like distant artillery buried beneath clouds. Ethan stayed where he was, one hand loose by his side, eyes fixed on the German shepherd standing motionless behind the steel gate. Most shelter dogs barked for attention. Some barked from fear. But Ash looked nothing like a frightened animal now. He looked focused, calculating. His amber eyes remained locked on the tattoo along Ethan's forearm with an intensity that made the air itself feel tighter. Then slowly, almost cautiously, the dog stepped forward. The movement was silent except for the faint click of nails against concrete. Ethan noticed the scars first. Thin pale marks hidden beneath sable fur around the chest and shoulder. Not random injuries. Harness rub. Working dog wear. Old operational damage. The kind no family pet ever carried. Funny, came a voice behind him. Ethan turned slightly. The older shelter worker from reception stood a few meters away holding a cleaning bucket with both hands. Her name tag read Margaret. Late 60s. Gray curls tucked beneath a knitted beanie. Tired eyes softened by years spent cleaning up after creatures nobody else wanted anymore. He does that sometimes, she murmured. Stares at people like he already knows them. Ethan looked back at Ash. Where did you say he came from? Margaret shrugged lightly. Nobody knows for sure. Animal control officer found him near Geelong freight yards. No microchip. No owner. Nothing. She hesitated before lowering her voice. But one of the officers figured he was military trained. Ethan's gaze sharpened instantly. Why? Dog ignored food for 2 days until somebody gave commands in German. The rain outside intensified, hammering the roof in thick bursts. Ash still had not taken his eyes off Ethan. Margaret leaned against the corridor wall with a weary sigh. He was different when he first arrived. Quiet. Too quiet. Then one day a volunteer tried taking him outside near the front gate. Her expression tightened slightly at the memory. Dog nearly tore the lead out of her hands trying to stop a man walking past with a little girl. Ethan felt something cold move slowly through his chest. Did the man do anything? No. That was the strange part. She rubbed her hands together for warmth. Perfectly polite. Smiled. Apologized. But Ash would not stop growling until they left. Ethan crouched slowly near the kennel gate. Ash stiffened at first, but did not retreat. Up close, the shepherd looked exhausted beneath all that tension. Tiny flecks of dried blood still marked the fur around his muzzle from smashing into the glass earlier. Ethan kept his voice low and steady. Easy, buddy. Ash's ears twitched instantly at the tone. Not the words. The cadence. The calm. Ethan had learned years ago that dogs trusted rhythm before language. Especially military dogs. Especially damaged ones. He extended his hand slowly toward the gate. Not close enough to touch. Just enough for scent. Ash inhaled once. Then again. Deep. Careful. The shepherd's entire posture changed. Not relaxed exactly, but conflicted. Like memory was fighting instinct inside him. Ethan noticed the trembling first. Tiny vibrations through the dog's front leg. Hypervigilance. Fatigue. Fear buried so deep it had become permanent. He had seen soldiers come home carrying the same thing behind their eyes. You served, didn't you? Ethan whispered almost unconsciously. Margaret frowned slightly. Sorry, but Ethan barely heard her. Because Ash had lowered his head. Not submissive. Listening. The way trained working dogs listen when they recognized authority they trusted once upon a time. Ethan's heartbeat slowed. Old memories drifted up. Through the rain and fluorescent light. Afghanistan. Heat waves over red dust. The metallic smell of armored vehicles under 40-degree sun. And beside him back then, always, a black German shepherd named Viper. Smart enough to detect explosives before machines could. Loyal enough to sleep outside Ethan's bunk every night for 14 months straight. Viper had died during Ethan's final deployment after alerting their convoy away from a damaged roadside bridge moments before collapse. 7 soldiers survived because of that dog. Ethan still dreamed about him sometimes. Usually around 3 in the morning when Melbourne went quiet enough for memory to creep back in. Ash suddenly turned his head sharply toward the corridor entrance. Every muscle along his spine tightened beneath wet sable fur. Ethan followed the movement instinctively. A man had entered reception near the front office. Mid-40s perhaps. Gray raincoat. Neatly combed dark hair damp from weather. Average build. Forgettable face. Yet the second Ash saw him, the low growl returned. Deep enough to vibrate through the kennel floor. Margaret sighed heavily. There he is again. Ethan glanced sideways. You know him? Comes in every few days asking about volunteering. Says he likes dogs. Something in her voice carried uncertainty now. Never stays long, though. The man smiled politely toward reception staff while signing something on a clipboard. Perfectly ordinary. But Ash's reaction intensified immediately. The shepherd stepped between Ethan and the corridor opening without taking his eyes off the staff officer. Not aggressive. Protective. Ethan felt the hairs rise along his neck. Because this was not random behavior anymore. This was pattern recognition. Military dogs were trained to identify threat indicators humans missed entirely. Chemical traces, body tension, heart rate changes, fierce sweat, behavioral anomalies invisible to most people. And sometimes after enough trauma, they never stopped scanning. The man in the raincoat glanced briefly down the hallway. Just 1 second. Yet the moment his eyes met Ash's, the shepherd released a sharp bark, so sudden even Margaret flinched backward. Reception. Workers looked over nervously. The man forced a thin smile. Dog still does not like me, eh? His voice sounded friendly enough. Australian accent. Soft-spoken. But Ash kept growling. Ethan stood slowly without answering. The staff officer adjusted his coat sleeve casually and walked back toward the exit. Ash tracked every movement until the front doors shut behind him and rain swallowed the sound of his footsteps outside. Only then did the shepherd stop barking. Silence settled heavily through the corridor. Margaret exhaled shakily. See what I mean now? Ethan stared toward the rain-streaked glass doors at the far end of reception. Something felt wrong. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just wrong in the quiet way danger often arrived before anybody else noticed it. Behind him, Ash moved closer to the kennel gate until his nose rested lightly against the steel bars beside Ethan's hand. The contact lasted barely a second, but it was enough. Because in that moment, Ethan realized something nobody else inside the shelter had understood yet. The dog was not reacting to cruelty. He was reacting to recognition. The storm lingered over Melbourne well past closing time, wrapping the shelter in cold silver rain and restless wind that rattled the loose guttering above the kennels. Most of the lights had already been switched off except for the dim corridor bulbs glowing weakly against concrete walls stained by years of damp winters. Somewhere near reception, a radio hummed softly with late-night talkback radio before fading into static again. Ethan remained crouched beside Ash's kennel long after Margaret finished mopping the floors. Neither man nor dog seemed eager to break the silence between them. Ash had finally laid down near the gate, though his amber eyes never fully closed. Working dogs learned young that real rest was dangerous. Ethan understood that feeling better than most people ever would. He leaned back against the corridor wall with a slow exhale, arms folded loosely across his chest while rainwater dripped from the hem of his jacket onto the concrete below. You always watch the exits too? He murmured quietly. One ear on the shepherd twitched. That was answer enough. Margaret appeared again carrying 2 chipped mugs of instant coffee that smelled faintly burnt. She handed one toward Ethan with a tired smile. You planning on sleeping here tonight? Ethan accepted the cup with a small nod of thanks. Wouldn't be the worst place I have slept. That earned the faintest laugh from her. Outside, thunder rolled again, softer this time, like the storm itself was moving farther out over Port Phillip Bay. Margaret glanced toward Ash before lowering her voice. You know, he only reacts like that around certain people. Ethan looked up. How many? For that I have seen. She rubbed her hands together against the cold. The first was that man tonight in the gray coat. Then there was a delivery driver last month. Ash went completely rigid the second he walked in. What happened? Nothing obvious. Margaret hesitated. But later that night, one of our donation tins disappeared. Ethan stared into his coffee quietly. And the others? A volunteer who got dismissed for stealing medication. She sighed heavily. And another man police questioned about missing pets down near Frankston. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Ash slowly lifted his head as if listening to every word. Ethan felt the uneasy pressure in his chest deepen. Dogs noticed patterns humans explained away. That was why military handlers trusted instincts before evidence. Sometimes danger announced itself in tiny things. Scent, breathing, body tension, Silence where there should have been warmth. Ethan remembered Viper once refusing to enter a village school during deployment despite thermal scans showing nothing unusual. 30 minutes later, engineers discovered unstable gas cylinders leaking beneath the foundation. The dog had smelled what machines missed. People called it coincidence afterward. Soldiers called it survival. Has anybody checked where Ash came from before Geelong? Ethan asked quietly. Margaret shook her head. Council tried. Nothing came back. No training records? No military tags either. She glanced toward the shepherd thoughtfully. But every now and then he responds to commands before people finish speaking them. Ethan looked back at Ash. The shepherd's gaze remained fixed toward the darkened reception area beyond the corridor. Watching. Waiting. Then suddenly the dog stood up. Not aggressively. Alertly. Ethan straightened instantly. Ash's ears angled forward toward the front office. A second later came the soft metallic click of the main entrance door opening. Margaret frowned. We're closed. Footsteps crossed reception slowly. Calm. Measured. Ethan recognized them before the figure appeared beneath the weak fluorescent lights. Gray raincoat. Damp hair. Same polite expression. The man from earlier carried a small umbrella folded neatly beneath one arm. Sorry to bother you again. He called gently toward reception. I think I left my phone here. Margaret stepped past Ethan with visible uncertainty. You did not ring before coming back. Only realized 5 minutes ago. The man smiled apologetically. Hope I'm not causing trouble. Ash released a low growl instantly. Not loud. Worse. Controlled. Ethan felt the tension ripple through the dog like a live wire beneath fur. The staffofficer glanced toward the kennel hallway and forced a nervous chuckle. Still not a fan of me, I see. Ethan watched carefully this time. Most people looked at barking dogs with irritation or fear. This man looked calculating. Measuring distance. Measuring reactions. Tiny things. Tiny dangerous things. Ash stepped forward until his body pressed hard against the kennel gate. The growl deepened. Ethan noticed something else now too. The shepherd was not looking at the man's face. He was staring at his hands. Specifically the left sleeve of the raincoat. The man caught Ethan observing him and quickly adjusted the cuff lower over his wrist. Small movement. Almost invisible. But Ash barked sharply the second it happened. Margaret flinched. Easy boy. The staffofficer forced another smile, though it looked thinner now. Maybe I should come back tomorrow. Ethan stood slowly to full height. Broad shoulders. Calm posture. Handler instinct settling quietly into place beneath his skin like old armor returning after years untouched. What phone are you looking for? The man blinked once. Sorry. Brand. Ethan's voice. Stayed polite. Color. Case. A pause. Barely 2 seconds. But trained eyes noticed hesitation differently than ordinary people did. Black Samsung, the man answered finally. Might have slipped near the front desk. Ethan nodded once without looking away. Reception cameras should help. Something flickered across the staffofficer's expression, then vanished immediately beneath another polite smile. No need to trouble yourselves. Ash barked again, loud enough to echo through every kennel in the corridor. Dogs farther down started whining nervously in response. The man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before relaxing again. Actually, he murmured, backing toward reception, I probably left it in the car. He turned quickly after that. Too quickly. Ethan watched him disappear through the front entrance into sheets of rain beyond the glass doors. Ash did not stop growling until the sound of the man's footsteps vanished completely beneath the storm outside. Silence settled again. Heavy. Wrong. Margaret stared toward the empty doorway uneasily. You think something is off with him too, do you not? Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to Ash's kennel and crouched again beside the gate. The shepherd's breathing remained fast, chest rising sharply beneath wet sable fur. Ethan lowered his voice almost to a whisper. What did you smell on him, buddy? Ash moved closer slowly until his nose touched the tattoo on Ethan's forearm once more. Rain tapped softly against the high windows overhead, while somewhere in the distance a police siren drifted across the city like a warning swallowed by darkness. Then Ethan noticed the shepherd trembling again. Not from fear this time, from memory. And suddenly, for the first time all night, Ethan realized Ash was not simply recognizing dangerous people. The dog was searching for someone he had encountered before. The shelter finally went quiet just after midnight. Rain still whispered against the roof in uneven waves, but the chaos from earlier had faded into that strange, hollow silence only old buildings carried after dark. Margaret had gone home an hour ago after insisting Ethan lock the front office. Before leaving, he said he would, but he never moved toward the exit. Instead, he sat cross-legged outside Ash's kennel beneath the weak fluorescent lights, one arm resting across his knee, while the German shepherd watched him through the bars without blinking. Somewhere farther down the corridor, another dog snored softly beneath blankets. Pipes groaned inside the walls. The whole shelter smelled faintly of bleach, wet fur, and stale heating vents struggling against the cold Victorian winter night. Ethan checked the time on his phone. 12:43. He should have been home already. Instead, he found himself staring at a dog he had met barely hours ago, as though the animal carried answers to questions he had spent years avoiding. Ash slowly stood and paced once across the kennel before returning to the gate. Tight pattern, measured steps, working dog behavior. Ethan recognized it immediately. Hypervigilance mixed with routine conditioning. The shepherd paused near the water bowl, but never drank. His ears kept shifting toward the front of the building every few seconds. Listening, Ethan leaned his head back against the concrete wall and closed his eyes briefly. You're waiting for him to come back, are you? Ash's tail gave one slow movement against the floor. Not wagging. Recognition. Ethan exhaled quietly. Yeah, I know that feeling too. The rain softened outside. Somewhere beyond the shelter grounds, tires hissed across wet roads. Melbourne never truly slept. It only quieted enough for lonely people to hear themselves think. Ethan rubbed his thumb absently across the faded tattoo on his right arm. The German shepherd inked there looked younger than the real dog it represented. Viper. 7 years gone now. Yet some nights Ethan still reached toward the empty side of his bed half awake, expecting to feel warm fur there. Trauma did strange things to memory. The body kept loving long after logic accepted loss. Ash suddenly froze. Completely. His ears snapped toward reception. Ethan opened his eyes instantly. Silence. Then came the faintest sound. A vehicle door shutting somewhere outside beyond the ring. Ash moved to the kennel gate, so quickly the metal rattled. Not barking. Watching. Ethan rose slowly to his feet and crossed toward the front corridor window. Through streaks of rainwater and reflected fluorescent light, he could barely make out the empty visitor parking lot. Most spaces sat dark beneath flickering lamps except one near the far gate, where a gray sedan idled quietly with headlights off. Ethan's stomach tightened. The same gray sedan from earlier. He knew it before his mind fully processed why. Ash released a low growl behind him. Ethan glanced toward the security monitor above the office desk. For camera feeds flickered across the screen in grainy black and white. Front gate. Reception. Parking lot. Kennel corridor. Empty except for rain and shadows moving beneath weak light. Yet the sedan remained there. Engine running. Waiting. Ethan stayed still for nearly 30 seconds watching the monitor. Military training taught patience before reaction. Observe first. Move second. Ash barked once sharply behind him. Ethan looked back toward the parking lot screen. A shape now stood beside the sedan near the rear passenger door. Tall figure. Hooded raincoat. The man from before. He was not trying to enter the shelter this time. He was simply standing there facing the building. Watching it. Ethan felt something cold settle beneath his ribs. Not fear exactly. Instinct. Ash began pacing again inside the kennel, claws clicking rapidly against concrete. Ethan moved closer to the monitor. The staffofficer lifted something briefly from the back seat of the car. Ethan narrowed his eyes. A small stuffed toy. Rabbit maybe. The man stared at it for several seconds before setting it back inside the vehicle again. Then he looked directly toward the shelter cameras. Ash barked violently. The staffofficer stepped back into the sedan almost immediately after and drove away through the rain without turning on headlights until reaching the road beyond the gates. Silence returned. Ethan stood frozen beside the monitor while water dripped steadily from a leak near the office ceiling into an old metal bucket below. Plink, plink, plink. Ash had stopped pacing now. The shepherd stood rigid near the kennel bars staring toward Ethan, with wide amber eyes full of something deeper than alarm. Recognition. Ethan swallowed slowly. You know him. The dog's breathing quickened. Ethan looked back toward the empty security feed. The stuffed rabbit lingered in his mind unpleasantly. Wrong detail. Wrong feeling. Tiny things again. Tiny terrible things. He crossed into the front office and sat heavily at the outdated desktop computer near reception. The shelter database loaded slowly beneath flickering fluorescent light. Intake records. Volunteer logs. Visitor sign-ins. Ethan searched recent entries until one name repeated several times over the past 2 months. Daniel Mercer. Visitor only. Interested in volunteer opportunities. No employment history listed. No emergency contact. Ethan frowned. Too blank. People were never that blank anymore. He opened another tab and searched public records instead. Slow internet. Rain interference. Finally, results appeared. Daniel Mercer. 46. Previously lived in New South Wales before relocating to Victoria 18 months ago. Casual labor work. No criminal convictions. Nothing obvious enough to stop him. Yet Ethan kept reading. One small article from a regional newspaper caught his attention halfway down the search results. Missing child investigation near Dubbo 3 years earlier. Witnesses reported seeing an unidentified gray sedan near a public reserve the afternoon before the disappearance. No charges filed. No suspects confirmed. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Coincidence maybe. But military instinct hated coincidence. Especially when dogs reacted first. Ash barked again from the corridor. Ethan looked up sharply. The shepherd stood facing the reception doors once more. Listening. Ethan heard it too now. Footsteps outside. Soft. Approaching through rainwater across concrete. Not hurried. Deliberate. Ethan moved silently toward the front office window and peered through the blinds. Empty parking lot. Empty footpath. Then movement. Small figure near the front gate. A child. Maybe 7 years old. Little girl wearing a yellow raincoat much too thin for the weather. Standing alone beside the road, clutching something against her chest. Ethan opened the shelter door immediately. Cold rain swept inside with the wind. Hey, he called gently. You all right there? The child looked up but did not answer. She only pointed silently toward the dark road disappearing beyond the trees. Ethan followed the direction with his eyes. Nothing except rain and distant streetlights. When he looked back, the girl had started trembling. Did somebody bring you here? Ethan asked softly, stepping closer. She nodded once. A man. Another nod. Ash barked wildly inside the shelter the second Ethan reached the gate. The little girl flinched hard at the sound and whispered something almost swallowed by the rain. That dog knows him too. Rainwater dripped steadily from the little girl's yellow raincoat onto the shelter tiles while the fluorescent lights above reception hummed with tired static. She looked impossibly small standing there beside the open doorway, both hands clutching a worn stuffed rabbit against her chest so tightly the fabric ears bent sideways. Ethan knelt slowly a few feet away to avoid frightening her further. Behind them, Ash barked again from the kennel corridor. Loud. Urgent. The girl flinched hard at the sound, but did not cry. That was what unsettled Ethan most. Children who had been truly frightened for too long often stopped crying altogether. Hey, he said gently, keeping his voice calm the way military counselors once taught traumatized civilians during evacuations overseas. You got a name, kiddo? The girl stared toward the floor for several seconds before answering softly. Mia. All right, Mia. Ethan offered the faintest smile. I'm Ethan. Another bark thundered from the corridor. Mia's grip tightened around the rabbit. He remembers the man, she whispered. Ethan felt cold settle quietly beneath his ribs. Outside, wind swept rain sideways across the shelter windows in silver streaks while distant traffic hissed along wet Melbourne roads. What man? Ethan asked carefully. Mia glanced toward the dark parking lot beyond the glass doors before lowering her eyes again. The one who talks nice. Ash began pacing rapidly inside the kennel corridor now, claws clicking against concrete with frantic rhythm. Ethan recognized operational stress behavior immediately. The shepherd was not simply anxious. He was anticipating something. Did the man bring you here tonight? Ethan asked. Mia nodded once. He said puppies lived here. Her small voice trembled slightly on the last word. Ethan exchanged a brief look toward the darkened corridor where Ash continued barking. Tiny details began connecting in his mind now. The stuffed rabbit in the gray sedan. The repeated visits. The way Ash reacted specifically to children near the man. Margaret's stories. The missing child article. None of it proved anything. Yet military instinct rarely waited for proof before sensing danger. Where are your parents, Mia? Ethan asked softly. Silence. The girl stared at the rabbit instead. Mum works nights. Does she know where you are? Another silence. Then very quietly, I was supposed to stay in the car. Ethan's jaw tightened. He kept his face calm anyway. Panic frightened children faster than truth did. He glanced toward the wall clock. 1:17 in the morning. Do you know the man's name? Mia shook her head. He buys me chips sometimes. Rain hammered suddenly against the roof hard enough to shake the loose guttering outside. Ash barked violently. Ethan stood immediately. Every nerve in his body had shifted into the same alert state he once carried during night patrols overseas. Not fear. Focus. He moved toward the security monitor beside reception and checked the parking lot feed again. Empty. No gray sedan. No movement. Yet Ash kept barking as though the threat had not left at all. Ethan looked toward Mia. Did the man tell you to wait here? She nodded slowly. He said he needed to get something. What sort of something? I do not know. She hesitated before whispering. But he was angry after the dog saw him. Ethan stared at her quietly. Children noticed emotion before language. That was why trained handlers often trusted children and dogs more than adults during investigations. Neither had learned how to hide instinct yet. Ash suddenly stopped barking. Completely. The silence that followed felt worse. Ethan turned sharply toward the kennel corridor. The shepherd stood, frozen at the gate, staring toward the rear emergency exit at the far end of the building. Ears forward, body rigid, listening. Ethan's heartbeat slowed the way it always did before trouble arrived. He crossed quickly toward the corridor, while Mia remained near reception, clutching the rabbit tightly against her chest. The shelter lights flickered once overhead as wind rattled the old windows. Halfway down the corridor, Ethan noticed something immediately wrong. The rear exit door stood slightly open, just a few centimeters. Enough for cold rain air to drift inside, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and eucalyptus. Ethan frowned. He distinctly remembered checking that door earlier. Ash growled low in his throat without looking away from the opening. Ethan approached carefully and pushed the door wider. Outside lay the narrow service lane running behind the shelter bins toward the back gate. Rainwater streamed along the pavement beneath weak yellow security lights. Empty, yet fresh tire tracks glistened through puddles near the fence line. Ethan crouched briefly beside them. Sedan tires. Recent. Ash barked sharply behind him, then pulled violently against the kennel latch. Ethan turned. The old gate had not been secured properly after cleaning. One more shove, and the shepherd burst free into the corridor. Ethan instinctively stepped sideways instead of blocking him. Ash sprinted directly past toward reception. Ash, Ethan called, but the dog ignored him completely. By the time Ethan reached the front office, Ash already stood beside Mia, trembling hard beside the reception desk. Not aggressive, protective. The shepherd pressed close enough that his shoulder touched the little girl's knees while his amber eyes remained fixed on the front entrance doors. Mia slowly lowered one hand onto the fur along his neck. He likes me, she whispered shakily. Ethan watched the dog carefully. This was the calmest Ash had appeared all night. Not because the danger was gone, because the shepherd had found the person he was trying to protect. Ethan moved slowly toward the office phone and dialed local police. Rain crackled through weak reception while Ash stayed beside Mia without moving an inch. Finally, a tired dispatcher answered. Ethan explained carefully. Shelter location. Child found alone. Possible suspicious adult. Gray sedan. The dispatcher promised officers would arrive shortly. Ethan hung up and exhaled slowly. Mia looked up at him with pale, frightened eyes. Is he coming back? Before Ethan could answer, Ash released another low growl toward the front doors. Headlights swept suddenly across reception windows from outside. A vehicle pulling into the parking lot. Ethan's entire posture tightened instantly. Through rain-streaked glass, he saw the shape of the gray sedan rolling slowly beneath the shelter lights again. Engine idling. Windshield wipers dragging steadily back and forth through the storm. The driver remained motionless behind the wheel for several seconds. Watching the building. Watching the child. Ash moved directly in front of Mia now, body low and rigid like a soldier stepping between danger and someone too small to defend themselves. Ethan felt the old handler instincts rise fully awake inside him for the first time in years. Because suddenly the shelter no longer felt like a lonely building full of abandoned animals. It felt like a place something dark had finally followed home. The gray sedan remained motionless beneath the shelter lights while rain streamed across the windscreen in silver ribbons. The engine hummed softly through the storm, steady and patient, like whoever sat behind the wheel had all the time in the world. Inside reception, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with nervous energy. Ash stood directly in front of Mia now, broad shoulders tense beneath his sable coat, amber eyes fixed on the vehicle beyond the glass. Ethan stayed near the office desk with one hand resting close to the landline phone, every instinct inside him measuring exits, distances, timing. Old habits never really died. They only slept until something woke them again. Mia crouched slowly beside Ash and buried trembling fingers into the thick fur along his neck. "He's angry," she whispered. Ethan looked down at her carefully. "The man in the car?" She nodded once without lifting her eyes. "He gets quiet when he is angry." Rain hammered harder against the windows. The sedan headlights switched off suddenly, plunging half the parking lot into darkness. Ash released a low growl deep enough to vibrate through the reception floor. Ethan moved closer to the front doors, but kept a careful distance from the glass. Through the storm, he could barely make out movement inside the sedan. A silhouette shifting, watching. Then slowly the driver door opened. Daniel Mercer stepped out holding no umbrella despite the rain. His gray coat darkened instantly beneath the downpour, while water rolled from his hair onto his shoulders. Yet he walked calmly toward the shelter entrance as though arriving for an ordinary appointment. Ash barked once. Sharp. Explosive. Mia flinched hard. Ethan crouched beside her quickly. "Listen to me," he said softly. "Stay behind the desk no matter what happens, all right?" The little girl nodded tightly while clutching the stuffed rabbit against her chest. Ethan rose again just as Mercer reached the front doors. The man offered a polite smile through rain-streaked glass. "Sorry about all this," he called calmly. "My daughter wandered off." Ethan did not open the door. "She says her name is Mia." "That's right." Mercer's smile remained steady. "She likes running around when she is upset." Ash barked furiously now, claws scraping against the tiles as he pushed closer toward the entrance. Mercer glanced at the dog briefly. For the first time, something cold slipped through the polite mask on his face. Not rage. Irritation. Like a man tired of being interrupted. Ethan noticed it immediately. Tiny things again. Tiny dangerous things. "Funny," Ethan said evenly. "She never called you Dad." Silence. Rainwater streamed from Mercer's coat cuffs onto the concrete outside. Then the smile returned. Too smooth. Too rehearsed. "Mia's had a difficult time lately." Ethan stayed still. "Police are already on their way." Something flickered in Mercer's eyes then vanished almost instantly. Ash growled louder. The shelter lights flickered once overhead as thunder rolled across the city. Mercer sighed softly through the glass. "You're making this more dramatic than it needs to be." Ethan folded, his arms slowly across his chest. Broad shoulders. Calm posture. The same stance he once used talking down frightened civilians overseas. "Then wait for the officers." Mercer's gaze shifted briefly toward Mia hiding behind reception. His expression softened in a way that somehow felt worse than anger. "Come on, sweetheart," he called gently. "We should go." Mia shook her head violently. Ash barked immediately after. Ethan noticed the little girl trembling harder now. Not confused. Terrified. Outside, Mercer's calm expression finally cracked slightly around the edges. "Mia," he said again, quieter this time. "Don't embarrass me." Ethan felt something dark move beneath those words. Not volume. Control. The kind that squeezed instead of shouted. Ash stepped closer to the glass doors, body low and rigid. Mercer looked directly at the shepherd now. Rain streamed down his face while the weak parking lot lights reflected strangely in his eyes. "That dog has always been a problem," he murmured almost to himself. Ethan's attention sharpened instantly. "Always. Not tonight. Not recently. Always." Ash barked violently again. Mercer took one slow step toward the entrance. Ethan moved in front of the doors immediately. "That's close enough." The two men stood facing each other through rain and glass, while thunder echoed over the shelter roof. One calm from training, the other calm from something colder. Mercer tilted his head slightly. "You military?" Ethan did not answer. Mercer's eyes drifted briefly toward the German shepherd tattoo along Ethan's right forearm. "Figures," he murmured. "Dogs like him usually attach themselves to damaged people." Ash snarled sharply at the words. Ethan barely reacted outwardly, though something inside him tightened hard. Mercer noticed anyway. Predators often noticed pain faster than kindness did. You think that animal is protecting her, Mercer continued quietly. But dogs confuse fear for danger all the time. Ethan looked down briefly at Ash beside him. The shepherd had not taken his eyes off Mercer once. Not blinking. Not wavering. Like memory itself stood in front of him wearing human skin. Then suddenly blue and red lights flickered. Faintly across the wet street beyond the shelter gates. Police. Still several hundred meters away, but close enough now to reflect against puddles and rain clouds. Mercer noticed them too. His face emptied instantly of expression. No panic. No rush. Somehow that felt worse. He simply stepped backward once from the entrance. Ash barked furiously. Mercer looked at the dog one final time through the rain. "You remember too much," he whispered softly. Then he turned and walked back toward the sedan without hurrying. Ethan watched carefully while the engine started again beneath the storm. The car reversed slowly from the shelter entrance and disappeared onto the wet road moments before the police vehicles reached the gates. Silence settled heavily afterward except for rain and Ash's breathing. Mia suddenly burst into tears behind reception. Not loud crying. Small exhausted sobs from a child who had spent too long trying to stay brave. Ethan knelt beside her immediately while Ash stayed pressed close against her legs protectively. "You're safe now," Ethan murmured gently. Mia wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her raincoat. "He said nobody would believe me." Ethan glanced toward Ash. The shepherd finally looked away from the doors for the first time all night and rested his head lightly against Mia's shoulder. Outside, police lights painted the shelter windows blue and red beneath the storm. But Ethan barely noticed them anymore. Because deep down he understood something now that changed everything. Ash had not become obsessed with Daniel Mercer by chance. The dog had encountered him before tonight. Before the shelter. Before Geelong. Somewhere in the dark corners of his missing past, the German shepherd had already learned exactly what kind of man Daniel Mercer really was. By the time the police finished speaking with Mia, the storm had begun drifting east across the city, leaving only cold mist and the distant smell of wet asphalt hanging over the shelter grounds. Dawn still sat hours away. The fluorescent lights inside reception looked paler now, exhausted from holding back darkness all night. 2 officers remained near the front desk filling out reports while Ethan sat quietly on the floor beside Mia with his back against the wall. Ash lay stretched across the tiles directly in front of them, head resting on his paws. Ears still alert despite obvious fatigue pulling at every line of his body. The little girl had finally stopped crying. One small hand remained tangled gently in the shepherd's fur as though letting go might pull her back into fear again. Senior Constable Rachel Byrne closed her notebook with a slow sigh and approached Ethan. Mid-40s. Sharp eyes softened by years spent seeing too many bad nights and badly. Rainwater still clung to the shoulders of her police jacket. "We contacted Mia's mother," she said quietly. "She's driving down from Ballarat now." Ethan nodded once. "Did the kid say anything else?" Rachel hesitated. "Enough to concern me." She glanced toward Mia carefully before lowering her voice. "Apparently, this Mercer man has been around the family for a few months. Helped the mother with shopping. School pickups. That sort of thing." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Trusted himself into their lives. Rachel gave a grim nod. "Wouldn't be the first time." Ash suddenly lifted his head from the floor. The shepherd stared toward the office hallway with sudden intensity. Ethan noticed instantly. "What is it, buddy?" Ash stood slowly. Not barking. Listening. Rachel frowned. "Dog hears every possum in Victoria." But Ethan was already watching the shepherd carefully. The change in posture was too familiar now. Something had triggered memory again. Ash moved toward the narrow hallway leading to storage rooms near the back offices. Ethan rose quietly and followed while Rachel exchanged a puzzled glance with the younger constable behind reception. The hallway smelled faintly of mold, paperwork, and old heaters running too long. Ash walked with measured focus now, nose low near the floor tiles. Ethan noticed the shepherd bypassed food storage, cleaning cupboards, and supply shelves without hesitation before stopping outside a locked records room near the rear office. Ash froze there completely, ears forward, tail rigid. Then came the soft whine. Not fear this time. Recognition mixed with distress. Ethan frowned at the door. "What is in there?" Rachel stepped closer behind him. "Old intake records mostly." Ash pawed once at the bottom of the door. Ethan's pulse slowed instinctively, the way it always did when puzzle pieces finally began moving toward each other. "Keys?" he asked quietly. Rachel unlocked the room a moment later. Warm, stale air drifted out, carrying the smell of cardboard, printer ink, and dust untouched for years. Filing cabinets lined the cramped walls beneath flickering fluorescent light. Ash entered immediately, nose working rapidly now. Ethan watched carefully as the shepherd moved past several shelves before stopping near a stack of old evidence tubs waiting for disposal. Then Ash barked once sharply at a faded plastic crate shoved near the back corner. Rachel crouched beside it. This came from council storage after Ash arrived here. Ethan knelt beside her while Ash paced anxiously nearby. Inside the crate sat several ordinary items sealed in plastic evidence bags. Torn lead, water-damaged blanket, rusted metal bowl. Then beneath them all, Ethan noticed something else. A faded black harness. Military grade. His breath caught slightly. He lifted it carefully from the crate while dust drifted through the weak fluorescent light. Ash immediately pressed close against him. On the inside strap, barely visible beneath wear and grime, sat faded stitched lettering. K9 Unit 4. Property of Southern Cross Special Response. Ethan stared silently. Rachel frowned beside him. Private contractor? Not exactly. Ethan ran his thumb slowly across the worn stitching. Southern Cross Special Response was an independent security and recovery unit occasionally contracted for remote search operations years ago. Highly trained canine teams. Disaster recovery. Missing persons. Sometimes trafficking investigations near ports and freight routes. Ethan remembered hearing about them during military liaison work overseas. Most of the handlers were former soldiers. This dog was operational, Ethan murmured quietly. Ash whined softly at his side. Ethan continued searching the crate carefully until another item caught his attention near the bottom. A weather-stained USB drive sealed inside evidence plastic. Rachel looked surprised. Never saw that logged. Ethan glanced toward her. Can we access it? 20 minutes later, they sat crowded around the ancient desktop computer in the front office while rain tapped gently against the windows outside. The younger constable finally managed to open the damaged files after several failed attempts. Grainy folders appeared on screen. Kennel reports. Operational logs. Then photographs. Ash younger. Leaner. Standing beside a tall male handler wearing dark field gear near shipping containers at a freight terminal. Ethan studied the image carefully. The handler's face had been partially cropped out, but one detail remained visible. A gray raincoat hanging from the back of a nearby vehicle. Rachel leaned closer toward the monitor. Zoom in. The image sharpened slightly, enough to reveal a registration number partially visible on the vehicle beside the handler. Ethan felt the cold sensation return immediately beneath his ribs. Same sedan model. Same color. Ash began growling softly beside the desk. Then another file opened automatically. Incident report. Dated 14 months earlier. Joint investigation into suspected child trafficking routes operating through abandoned freight depots between Victoria and New South Wales. One handler missing during operation. K9 unit recovered alone near Geelong docks 3 weeks later, showing signs of severe stress and operational trauma. Ethan stared at the screen while silence settled heavily through the office. Rachel read the final line aloud almost under her breath. Primary suspect escaped prior to arrest. Ash rested his head slowly against Ethan's knee. The shepherd trembled faintly beneath his hand. Ethan finally understood now why the dog reacted so violently whenever Daniel Mercer appeared. Ash had not simply recognized the man from some random encounter. The shepherd had hunted him before. Somewhere inside the fractured memory of a traumatized working dog, Daniel Mercer remained tied forever to a night of fear, missing children, and a handler who never came home. The sun finally began rising over Melbourne sometime after 6, though the city barely noticed beneath thick winter clouds and lingering rain. Pale gray light filtered through the shelter windows, washing the reception area in the color of old photographs. The storm had passed, but its weight still clung to everything. Damp blankets, muddy footprints, cold coffee forgotten beside police reports. Ethan sat alone near the office desk while Ash slept beside his boots for the first time since the night began. Not fully asleep. The shepherd still twitched occasionally at distant sounds. but the tension inside him had softened enough for dreams to finally reach him. Mia and her mother had left nearly an hour earlier after emotional conversations with police and child protection officers. Ethan remembered the way Mia hugged Ash before leaving. The little girl pressed her face into the thick fur along his neck and whispered something only the dog heard. Ash simply leaned against her quietly with tired amber eyes half closed. Some souls recognized safety the moment they touched it. Rachel Byrne stepped back into reception carrying a paper bag that smelled faintly of bacon rolls and burnt takeaway coffee. "You look terrible," she muttered, setting one beside Ethan anyway. Ethan rubbed tired eyes with one hand. "Cheers." Rachel sat opposite him beneath the humming fluorescent lights and studied Ash carefully. "You know what bothers me most?" Ethan glanced up. "What?" That dog remembered him after 14 months. She looked toward the shepherd again. "Most people cannot even remember what they had for breakfast yesterday." Ethan stared quietly at the faded security monitor across the room, where rainwater still shimmered across empty parking lots. Dogs remember feelings differently. Rachel leaned back slowly. "You saying Ash remembers fear?" Ethan shook his head once. "No." He looked down at the sleeping shepherd beside him. "I think he remembers failing." Silence settled heavily between them. Outside, magpies called somewhere beyond the shelter fence line, while morning traffic slowly returned to the streets. Ethan reached toward the old harness resting on the desk nearby. K9 Unit 4. Property of Southern Cross Special Response. The faded stitching looked almost fragile in daylight. "Operational dogs bond hard with handlers," Ethan said quietly. "Harder than most people realize." Rachel listened without interrupting. When something goes wrong during a mission, Ethan hesitated briefly. Some dogs never stop replaying it. They think staying alert might undo the past somehow. Ash shifted slightly in his sleep at the sound of Ethan's voice. One ear twitched toward him instinctively. Rachel folded her arms slowly. "You think Mercer killed the handler?" Ethan stared toward the rain-streaked windows. "I think Ash saw enough that night to understand exactly what Mercer is." Rachel sighed tiredly. "Not enough evidence to move on yet." "No," Ethan's jaw tightened faintly, "but enough to keep digging." The older constable approached, then carrying several printed files from the patrol car outside. "We ran Mercer through state databases again," he said. "Bloke changes addresses every 6 months. Casual jobs. Different mobile numbers. No stable connections." Rachel frowned. Classic drift pattern. "Gets officer, though." The constable handed her another report. 3 separate missing child investigations over the past 4 years place him within 50 kilometers of each incident. Ethan's pulse slowed again. Focus replacing exhaustion. "Any convictions?" "Nothing solid." The officer shook his head. "Always cooperative. Always clean records." Ash suddenly woke beside Ethan's chair. Not violently. Slowly. Like something unseen had brushed against his memory again. The shepherd lifted his head and stared toward the reception window overlooking the road. Ethan followed his gaze instinctively. A council bus rolled past through lingering mist outside. Nothing unusual. Yet Ash remained alert. Watching. Rachel noticed too. What is he hearing? Ethan listened quietly. Then he heard it himself beneath distant traffic noise. A faint metallic clinking. Rhythmic. Soft. Ash stood immediately. The sound grew clearer seconds later. Bicycle chains. A postie riding along the footpath outside. The moment the cyclist passed beyond view, Ash relaxed again. Ethan frowned thoughtfully. He's scanning patterns constantly. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Military conditioning. And trauma. Ethan rubbed a hand slowly across his jaw. Operational dogs learn danger hides and routines. Sounds. Repetition. He looked toward the shepherd again. That's why he reacts before people notice anything. The constable studied Ash uneasily. Feels almost human. Ethan gave a faint, tired smile. Sometimes dogs are just honest about instincts people train themselves to ignore. The office phone rang suddenly, sharp enough to cut through the quiet shelter like a snapped wire. Everyone froze briefly. Rachel answered first. Her expression changed almost immediately. "You're certain?" Silence while she listened. "All right. Send the footage through." She hung up slowly and looked toward Ethan. Petrol station cameras picked up Mercer's sedan near Footscray at 4 this morning. Ethan frowned. "Near my suburb?" Rachel nodded grimly. Vehicle slowed twice outside a primary school before continuing north. Ash growled softly under his breath. Ethan stared at the shepherd. He knows. Rachel crossed her arms tightly. We're putting surveillance requests through now. Ethan rose slowly from the chair and grabbed his jacket from the back office hook. Then I'm not leaving him here. Rachel blinked. The dog. Ethan nodded once. Mercer came back because of Ash. Whatever happened at those freight depots, he looked down at the shepherd quietly. This dog is the one thing connecting him to unfinished mistakes. Ash stood beside Ethan immediately as though understanding every word. The old harness still rested across the desk between them. Rachel watched the pair silently for several seconds before exhaling through her nose. You realize this sounds insane, right? Ethan clipped the lead gently onto Ash's collar. Maybe. He glanced toward the weak morning light beyond the windows. But every time that dog reacts, something dark turns up afterward. Ash moved close beside Ethan's leg while rainwater dripped softly from the shelter roof outside. For the first time since arriving, the shepherd no longer looked like an abandoned animal waiting for another disappointment. He looked like a working dog beside his handler again. Tired, scarred, but purposeful. Ethan rested one hand briefly against the fur behind Ash's ears. The shepherd leaned into the touch without hesitation. Somewhere deep beneath exhaustion and memory, trust had finally begun returning to both of them at the exact same time. The rain finally stopped sometime near midday, leaving Melbourne washed pale beneath thick winter clouds and cold silver light. Water still clung to tram cables and gumtree branches along the streets while the city moved through its ordinary routines completely unaware that somewhere inside it, an old working dog was hunting a memory nobody else could see. Ethan drove slowly through Footscray with Ash seated upright in the passenger seat of the aging Land Cruiser, eyes fixed on the passing streets beyond the rain-speckled window. The shepherd had barely moved since leaving the shelter. No restless pacing, no anxious barking. Just silence and constant observation. Every pedestrian, every alley, every parked vehicle. Ethan noticed the pattern immediately. Ash was working again. The old military harness rested folded carefully on the back seat beside a thermos of coffee and several printed police reports Rachel had reluctantly handed over before they left. Officially, Ethan was only helping monitor possible locations tied to Mercer's movements. Unofficially, Rachel had cleared Ethan to keep Ash close under police supervision, because everyone at the shelter now understood the dog was connected to the investigation in ways paperwork could not explain. The heater hummed softly inside the vehicle while low clouds rolled over the western suburbs. Ethan glanced briefly toward Ash. You remember these streets? One ear twitched. The shepherd's gaze never left the road ahead. Ethan drove another 2 kilometers before stopping outside his small weatherboard house near the Melbourne River. The front garden looked neglected beneath winter weeds and fallen leaves. A bicycle leaned rusting against the side fence exactly where Ethan left it weeks earlier. Home had become less a place lately and more somewhere his body slept between difficult nights. Ash stepped out of the Land Cruiser slowly and immediately. Scanned the street with alert amber eyes. Ethan unlocked the front door while the smell of stale coffee, old timber, and cold air drifted out to meet them. The shepherd hesitated at the threshold. Ethan crouched beside him quietly. You're safe here, buddy. Ash studied the doorway several seconds before finally stepping inside. The house felt painfully silent after the chaos of the shelter. No television, no music, only the ticking kitchen clock and distant magpies outside. Ash padded cautiously across the wooden floorboards, nose working through unfamiliar scents. Ethan noticed the moment the shepherd stopped beside an old military footlocker near the hallway. Ash sniffed once, then again. Slowly the dog sat down beside it without moving further. Ethan swallowed faintly. The footlocker still contained Viper's old lead, training tags, and photographs Ethan had not touched in years. Some grief remained sealed because opening it felt too much like reopening a wound that barely scarred over the first time. Ethan crossed into the kitchen and filled a steel bowl with fresh water while Ash continued sitting beside the locker quietly. You know, Ethan called softly, you are the first dog that has walked into this house since him. Ash finally looked toward him. There was no miracle in the dog's eyes. No magical understanding. Just something simpler. Recognition of another creature carrying ghosts too heavy to explain aloud. Ethan set the bowl near the kitchen table. Ash drank carefully for nearly 30 seconds before suddenly freezing mid-step. Water dripped from his muzzle onto the floorboards. Ethan felt the change instantly. The shepherd's ears lifted toward the front window, body rigid, listening. Ethan moved quietly beside him and peered through the curtains toward the street outside. Empty footpath, damp road, wind stirring leaves along the gutters. Then he saw it. Parked half a block away beneath a gum tree sat the gray sedan. Engine off this time. Empty driver's seat. Ethan's pulse slowed immediately. Focus replacing comfort. Ash released a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Ethan grabbed his phone and dialed Rachel while keeping his eyes fixed on the vehicle outside. No answer. Probably still tied up filing reports. He left a short message instead. Mercer's car is outside my place. Call me. Ash moved suddenly toward the hallway. Ethan followed quickly. The shepherd stopped beside the back door now, nose pressed low near the frame. Sniffing. Ethan frowned. Then came the sound. Soft metal movement outside near the rear fence. Ash barked once sharply and lunged toward the door. Ethan opened it instantly. Cold wind swept into the kitchen carrying damp eucalyptus and river air. The backyard looked empty at first glance except for overgrown grass moving beneath the breeze. Then Ethan spotted movement near the side gate. A figure disappearing beyond the fence line toward the laneway behind the house. Too far to identify clearly. But Ash already knew. The shepherd sprinted into the yard before Ethan could stop him. Ash. Ethan followed immediately through wet grass and muddy patches while the dog raced toward the open gate. By the time Ethan reached the laneway, Ash stood frozen beside a rusted rubbish bin near the alley wall. Growling softly, Ethan approached carefully and saw what the dog had found. A small stuffed rabbit sitting upright against the bricks. The same rabbit Mia carried at the shelter. Rainwater darkened the faded fabric ears. Ethan's chest tightened. Mercer had been here. Recently. Deliberately. Not hiding anymore. Sending a message. Ash sniffed the toy once before stepping backward abruptly, tension rippling through his body again. Ethan crouched beside the rabbit carefully. Tucked beneath it sat a folded piece of paper weighted against the wind. Ethan unfolded it slowly. 3 handwritten words stared back at him in neat, careful lettering. He remembers wrong. Silence settled heavily through the laneway while distant traffic drifted across the suburb. Ash stared toward the far end of the alley, ears rigid toward something Ethan could not yet hear. Then came another sound beneath the wind. A child laughing somewhere nearby. Ash barked instantly and bolted down the laneway toward the river path without hesitation. Ethan sprinted after him, boots splashing through puddles while cold air burned his lungs. Up ahead, the shepherd disappeared around the bend near the walking tracks beside the Melbourne River. Ethan followed hard until he finally saw Ash again standing near the playground overlooking the water. The dog had stopped beside a swing set where a little boy sat alone, kicking gently back and forth beneath the gray afternoon sky. No parents nearby. No adults at all. Just the child. And tied carefully around the swing chain beside him hung another faded stuffed rabbit, swaying softly in the wind. The swing creaked softly in the cold afternoon wind while gray clouds drifted low over the Melbourne River like smoke that refused to rise. The little boy sitting on the swing could not have been older than 6. Freckles across pale cheeks. Blue sweater too thin for the weather. Mud on one shoe where he had clearly stepped off the path somewhere alone. He kicked gently back and forth without looking up, small hands wrapped around the rusted chains while the faded stuffed rabbit swayed beside him in the breeze. Ash stood 10 meters away, completely motionless. Not barking now. Watching. Ethan slowed his breathing and approached carefully across the damp playground mulch. Nearby gum trees whispered above the walking path, while distant traffic hummed faintly beyond the riverbank. Hey there, buddy, Ethan called gently. The boy looked up slowly. Calm eyes. Too calm. Ethan recognized that expression instantly from overseas evacuations years ago. Children who trusted the wrong adults often looked strangely composed because fear had become normal before anybody noticed. You all right sitting here by yourself? The boy shrugged once. Ash took another cautious step forward. The child's eyes shifted immediately toward the German shepherd. That dog knows him too, he whispered. Ethan felt cold move through his chest. Who? The boy lowered his gaze again. The nice man. Wind rattled the swing chain softly. Ethan crouched several meters away to avoid overwhelming him. You got a name? Oliver. All right, Oliver. Ethan kept his voice steady. Did the nice man bring you here? A small nod. He said he needed to get my mum medicine. Ethan's jaw tightened. Slightly. Another rabbit. Another child left waiting. Not random anymore. Ritual. Pattern. Ash suddenly moved closer until he stood beside the swing without growling. The shepherd lowered his head gently toward the little boy's shoes and inhaled slowly. Then Ethan noticed something strange. Ash whimpered. Not aggressive. Heartbroken. The kind of sound dogs made when memory hurt more than fear. Oliver carefully reached one small hand toward the shepherd's neck. Ash did not move away. He smells the same, the boy whispered. Ethan frowned. What smells the same? The sheds. Silence. Even the wind seemed to pause around them. Ethan felt his pulse slow into that terrible calm soldiers sometimes reached right before truth arrived. What sheds, Oliver? The child stared toward the river without answering immediately. The place with trucks. Ash's ears lifted sharply. Ethan glanced toward the shepherd. Every muscle in the dog's body had tightened again. Did the man take you there? Oliver nodded faintly. There were other kids before. Ethan's stomach dropped. Not panic. Worse. Confirmation. Ash barked once suddenly and spun toward the walking track leading beneath the bridge farther along the river path. Ethan looked up instantly. Movement. Gray coat disappearing briefly between trees near the bike trail. Daniel Mercer. Watching from a distance again. Ethan stood immediately. Oliver, he said calmly. I need you to stay right here with the dog, all right? Ash remained planted beside the swing, eyes locked on the trees ahead. The little boy clutched the stuffed rabbit tighter, but nodded slowly. Ethan moved down the river path fast, boots splashing through shallow puddles while cold air burned his lungs. Up ahead, Mercer walked calmly beneath the bridge shadows as though out for an afternoon stroll. No panic. No running. Ethan recognized the tactic immediately. Men like Mercer relied on appearing ordinary because ordinary people frightened less suspicion than fear ever did. Mercer, Ethan called sharply. The man stopped beneath the concrete overpass beside the river. Water dripped steadily from the bridge above while cyclists passed farther down the trail unaware of anything wrong. Mercer turned slowly. You should not chase officers, Ethan. Calm voice. Calm smile. Ash's distant bark echoed from the playground behind them. Mercer glanced toward the sound briefly before sighing. That dog has made everything difficult. Ethan stepped closer carefully. You used children to lure him. No, Mercer shook his head almost sadly. The dog lured me. Wind swept cold river air beneath the bridge. Ethan noticed the same tiny details again. Controlled breathing. Relaxed posture. Eyes always measuring exits. Mercer looked less like a frightened criminal and more like a man irritated his routine had been interrupted. Ash was there that night at the freight depot, was he not? Ethan asked quietly. Mercer's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not guilt. Memory. Dogs should not remember things humans barely understand, he murmured. Ethan held his stare. What happened to the handler? Mercer looked out across the gray river for several seconds before answering. Good men always believe they can save everyone. The words settled heavily beneath the bridge. Ethan felt anger stir deep inside him, but kept his posture still. Handlers learned long ago that rage clouded observation. Children disappeared, Ethan said evenly. Ash tracked you. Mercer gave the faintest smile. No, he tracked fear. Behind them another bark echoed sharply. Closer now. Ethan glanced back instinctively. Ash was running down the path toward them with Oliver beside him and two police officers hurrying after from the far playground entrance. Rachel Byrne among them. Mercer noticed immediately. For the first time, the calm mask slipped slightly around his eyes. Tiny fracture. Tiny truth. Ash reached Ethan seconds later and positioned himself directly between Mercer and the approaching officers without command. Low growl. Body rigid. Protective. Rachel slowed beside Ethan, breathing hard. We found another witness, she said quietly without taking her eyes off Mercer. Former dock worker from Geelong. Recognized the dog from the investigation 14 months ago. Mercer remained still beneath the bridge while police approached cautiously around him. No shouting. No dramatic movement. Only cold winter wind moving river water beneath concrete shadows. Ash growled deeper now. Then unexpectedly Mercer looked directly at the dog. Really looked at him for the first time. Something almost human flickered there beneath the calm surface. Regret maybe. or resentment that memory itself had finally refused to stay buried. You never stopped searching, did you? Mercer whispered softly. Ash barked once. Not viciously. Final. Rachel stepped forward beside the officers while handcuffs clicked quietly in the cold air. Yet Ethan barely watched anymore, because Ash had suddenly gone still again beside him. The shepherd stared toward the riverbank beneath the bridge where old freight tracks disappeared west toward abandoned industrial yards near the docks. Then Ethan understood. Mercer was not the end of the memory haunting Ash. Somewhere out there near the forgotten shipping routes and rusted warehouses beside the river, something else from that night still remained unfound. Even after Daniel Mercer disappeared into the back of the police wagon, Ash remained standing beneath the bridge staring toward the abandoned freight tracks beyond the riverbank. The winter wind carried the smell of wet steel, river mud, and old engine oil through the concrete underpass, while police radios crackled softly nearby. Rachel Byrne spoke with officers several meters away, but Ethan barely heard any of it anymore. His attention stayed fixed on the German shepherd beside him. Ash had not relaxed. Not truly. The shepherd's body remained tense beneath the faded military harness now strapped gently across his shoulders again. Ears forward, eyes locked westward where rusted rail lines vanished into the industrial outskirts near the docks. Ethan understood the feeling all too well. Sometimes a mission did not end when the danger stopped. Sometimes it ended only when the missing finally came home. Oliver sat wrapped in a police blanket near the patrol car, drinking warm hot chocolate from a paper cup, while an officer stayed beside him quietly. The little boy looked safer now beneath flashing blue lights and adult voices, yet every few seconds he glanced toward Ash with the strange trust frightened children reserved for creatures that protected them before people did. Rachel finally approached Ethan beneath the bridge. Mercer is not talking, she said tiredly, but forensic teams are already heading toward the old freight depots. Ethan nodded once without looking away from Ash. The dog wants to go there. Rachel folded her arms against the cold wind. You really believe that? Ethan crouched beside the shepherd slowly. Look at him. Ash stood completely still except for tiny tremors moving beneath his fur. Not fear. Anticipation. He's tracking memory. Rachel exhaled through her nose. You know this sounds impossible. Ethan finally looked toward her. So did a traumatized shelter dog identifying a child predator before police databases did. Silence settled briefly between them while river water moved darkly beneath the bridge. Rachel glanced toward the freight tracks disappearing beyond the industrial yards. The old Southern Cross operation happened near Docklands storage terminals, she admitted quietly. Most of those warehouses were abandoned after the shipping routes changed. Ash barked suddenly and pulled once against the lead toward the tracks. Ethan stood immediately. There. Rachel hesitated. Forensics are still 30 minutes out. Ethan looked toward the shepherd, then toward the distant rusted yards hidden beneath heavy clouds and sea fog rolling inland from the bay. If there is something out there connected to those missing kids, he tightened his grip gently on the lead. Ash already knows where. 20 minutes later, the land cruiser rolled slowly through the outer industrial roads west of Docklands beneath a sky the color of cold ash. Rachel sat in the passenger seat beside Ethan while Ash stood in the back, restless now for the first time all day. Outside, abandoned warehouses stretched along the old shipping district like rusted skeletons beside empty rail yards and silent loading cranes. Wind rattled loose sheet metal somewhere far off while seagulls circled above the bay. The entire area smelled of salt water, diesel, and rain-soaked concrete. Ethan slowed near a chain-link fence, broken open beside a disused rail crossing. Ash barked immediately. That's it, Ethan murmured. Rachel looked uneasy. Place gives me the creeps. Ethan parked beside the fence and stepped out into the cold wind. Ash jumped down instantly and pulled toward the opening without hesitation. Beyond the fence lay rows of abandoned storage sheds swallowed slowly by weeds and time. Broken windows, graffiti, rust bleeding down corrugated walls. Somewhere nearby, loose metal clanged softly in the wind like distant bells. Ash moved through the yards with frightening certainty. No hesitation. No confusion. The shepherd tracked invisible memory through the maze of warehouses as though retracing steps carved permanently into his mind. Rachel stayed close behind Ethan, while two additional officers followed farther back, carrying flashlights despite the fading afternoon light. How long since anyone searched this area properly? Ethan asked quietly. Over a year, Rachel admitted. Most evidence teams moved on after the operation collapsed. Ash suddenly stopped outside Warehouse 12. The building sat farther from the others near the waterline where fog drifted thick between shipping containers and abandoned forklifts. One side door hung partially open beneath faded warning signs almost erased by weather. The shepherd whined softly. Ethan felt every muscle in his body tighten. This is where he lost the handler, he whispered. Ash stepped inside first. The warehouse smelled of dust, salt air, damp timber, and something older hidden beneath it all. Rows of empty crates stood beneath shattered skylights where weak daylight filtered through fog. Water dripped steadily somewhere in the darkness. Rachel swept her flashlight slowly across the concrete floor. Nothing here. But Ash kept moving deeper into the building. Ethan followed quietly until they reached the far rear corner near a collapsed office partition. There the shepherd froze completely. Then slowly, carefully, Ash laid down beside the wall. Ethan frowned. What is it, buddy? Ash pawed once at the concrete floor. Rachel moved closer with her flashlight. Hold on. The beam caught faint scrape marks near an old drainage hatch partly hidden beneath debris. One officer knelt and pulled the rusted cover aside with effort. Cold air drifted upward from the darkness below, carrying stale dampness untouched for years. Ethan crouched beside Ash while officers aimed flashlights downward into the narrow maintenance tunnel beneath the warehouse. Silence. Then Rachel inhaled sharply. There is something down there. 30 minutes later, rescue crews arrived with proper lighting equipment while fog rolled heavily across the docks outside. Ethan stayed beside Ash the entire time. The shepherd trembled constantly now, amber eyes fixed on the open hatch as workers carefully descended below. Finally, one of the rescue officers climbed back up slowly into the weak warehouse light. His expression said everything before words arrived. We found remains, he said quietly. Rachel lowered her eyes immediately. Ethan felt Ash press hard against his leg beside him. Not panic. Grief. The officer removed a weather-damaged identification tag sealed carefully inside an evidence bag. Southern Cross Special Response. Handler Daniel Cross. Ethan swallowed hard. Ash whimpered softly the moment the name was spoken aloud. Then the shepherd did something that broke every hardened officer inside that warehouse. Slowly, painfully, Ash walked to the edge of the open hatch and sat down facing the darkness below, like a soldier standing final watch beside someone he never managed to bring home. The fog over docklands thickened as evening settled across the abandoned freight yards, turning rusted warehouses into blurred shadows beneath pale, industrial lights. Police vehicles lined the cracked access road outside Warehouse 12 now, their flashing blue reflections rippling softly across puddles and wet steel containers. Yet inside the building, everything had gone strangely quiet. No radio chatter. No hurried footsteps. Only the distant drip of water echoing through the maintenance tunnel below and the slow breathing of a tired German shepherd standing watch beside the open hatch. Ash had not moved in nearly 20 minutes. The shepherd sat rigid near the tunnel entrance while officers worked carefully beneath the warehouse floor recovering the remains of Daniel Cross. Ethan remained beside him the entire time. One hand rested gently against the thick sable fur along the dog's shoulders while cold wind drifted through broken skylights overhead, carrying salt air from the bay. Rachel Byrne approached quietly from the rear office area, holding a folded evidence blanket across one arm. Her expression looked softer now. Less police officer. More human. Forensics confirmed the identification, she said gently. Ethan nodded once. Ash lowered his head slightly at the sound of the handler's name again. Rachel glanced toward the shepherd. You know. She hesitated before continuing. Most people would have assumed this dog was dangerous. Ethan looked down at Ash quietly. Most people only notice fear once it becomes loud. The weak warehouse lights hummed overhead while rescue crews moved carefully below. Rachel crouched beside them near the hatch. Mercer finally started talking after they confronted him with the tunnel discovery. Ethan's eyes lifted slowly. What did he say? Rachel exhaled through her nose. Cross and Ash nearly uncovered the entire operation 14 months ago. Children moved through abandoned freight routes between states using fake transport manifests. Ethan felt Ash tremble faintly beneath his hand. Cross got separated inside the warehouse during the raid. Mercer sealed the lower tunnel and fled before police arrived. Silence settled heavily again. Outside, foghorns drifted faintly across the bay like ghosts moving through water. Rachel lowered her voice. Ash stayed here for days after the operation collapsed. Ethan looked toward her sharply. What? Dock workers reported hearing barking inside the yards almost every night afterward. Rachel glanced toward the shepherd. By the time officers found him near Geelong, he was starving and half feral. But he kept trying to return to these warehouses. Ethan swallowed slowly. Ash had never been broken. He had been grieving, waiting, refusing to abandon the handler he could not save. The same loyalty that made military dogs heroic also made loss unbearable for them. Ethan understood that too deeply. He remembered the weeks after Viper died overseas. The empty silence beside his bunk. The guilt. The strange feeling that survival itself had become a betrayal because somebody loyaler than you did not come home. Ash slowly stood from beside the hatch, then turned toward Ethan for the first time since entering the warehouse. The shepherd's amber eyes looked exhausted now. Not fearful, just tired in the way only creatures carrying long sorrow could become. Ethan crouched beside him quietly. You brought him back, buddy. Ash pressed his forehead gently against Ethan's chest. Tiny movement, but it shattered something heavy inside the old handler. Because for the first time since meeting the dog, Ash no longer felt like an animal trapped inside memory. He felt like someone finally laying down a burden too heavy to carry alone anymore. Rachel looked away respectfully while Ethan wrapped one arm slowly around the shepherd's neck. You did good, he whispered softly. You did real good. Hours later, the recovery teams finally emerged from the tunnel carrying Daniel Cross home beneath the cold warehouse lights. Every officer removed hats silently as they passed. No speeches, no ceremony, just quiet respect moving through fog and steel and winter air. Ash watched the entire procession without barking once. Ethan stayed beside him while the shepherd's eyes followed the stretcher toward the waiting coroner vehicle outside. Then suddenly Ash took several slow steps forward and stopped beside the open rear doors. One rescue worker froze uncertainly. Ethan gave a small nod. Ash gently lowered his head toward the covered stretcher for only a second. Like a final goodbye 14 months late. Nothing dramatic happened afterward. No music. No miracle. Just silence and fog drifting across the docks, while one loyal dog finally understood his handler was no longer alone in the dark beneath that warehouse. The ride back through Melbourne happened quietly beneath light rain returning across the city after sunset. Ash slept most of the journey beside the passenger seat, exhausted beyond anything Ethan had seen yet. Every now and then the shepherd twitched softly in his sleep, but the panic was gone now. No sudden jerking awake. No frantic scanning of mirrors and windows. Only tired breathing and long overdue rest. Ethan drove one-handed through wet streets glowing gold beneath tram lights and takeaway shop signs. The city moved around them in ordinary rhythms again. Couples carrying groceries. Kids laughing outside fish and chip shops. Cyclists weaving through drizzle. Nobody noticing the old handler and exhausted German shepherd returning home together through the rain. Back at the weatherboard house near the river, Ethan opened the front door quietly while Ash padded slowly inside. The shepherd paused beside the old military footlocker again. This time, instead of sitting beside it silently, Ash walked over to Ethan's worn couch near the heater and collapsed heavily onto the blankets there with a long, exhausted sigh. Ethan stood watching him for several seconds. Then something inside him softened too. He crossed to the hallway cupboard and carefully removed Viper's old lead and metal water bowl from storage for the first time in 7 years. Dust clung to both beneath the warm kitchen light. Ethan placed the bowl gently beside Ash without speaking. The shepherd lifted tired amber eyes toward him briefly before resting his head back down. Outside, rain whispered softly against the windows while the heater clicked and hummed through the quiet house. Ethan finally sat down on the floor beside the couch, one hand resting lightly against the sleeping dog's fur. And sometime deep into that long winter night, for the first time in years, neither of them woke from the ghosts they used to carry alone. 3 months later, winter finally loosened its grip on Melbourne. The morning still carried a chill drifting off the Maribyrnong River, but sunlight lingered longer now across the weatherboard houses and gum trees lining the quiet suburban streets. Birds returned before dawn. Children rode bicycles through puddles left from overnight rain. And inside Ethan Walker's little house near the river, something gentle had begun living where silence used to sit. The old handler woke just after 6 to the smell of coffee and damp earth drifting through the open kitchen window. Soft golden light filtered across the timber floorboards while somewhere outside a lawn mower hummed faintly 2 streets away. Ethan stood barefoot near the stove in gray sweatpants and an old military sweater, one hand resting absently against the faded German shepherd tattoo on his right forearm, while the kettle hissed softly beside him. Behind him came the familiar sound of claws tapping slowly across wood. Ash appeared in the hallway carrying one of Ethan's boots gently in his mouth. Not because he had destroyed it. Because every morning now, without fail, the shepherd brought Ethan his boots before their walk. Small rituals. Tiny acts of loyalty stitched quietly into ordinary life. Ethan looked over his shoulder and smiled faintly. "You reckon I'm moving too slow, do you?" Ash dropped the boot carefully beside him and leaned briefly against Ethan's leg. The dog looked different now. Healthier. Stronger. The dull anxiety that once lived permanently behind his amber eyes had softened into something calmer. Some scars never vanished entirely. Certain loud sounds still made him alert. He still checked exits in crowded places. Still watched children carefully in parks like a silent guardian who trusted danger less than anyone should. But the fear no longer controlled him. After Mercer's arrest, authorities uncovered enough evidence from the freight operations to reopen several missing persons investigations across Victoria and New South Wales. Families finally received answers they thought were lost forever. Daniel Cross was buried with full honors beneath clear blue skies outside Geelong 2 weeks later. Ethan attended quietly near the back of the memorial service while Ash sat beside him wearing the old Southern Cross harness one final time. When the folded flag was presented to Cross's elderly parents, Ash lowered his head gently and remained still through the entire ceremony. Not one bark, not one sound, just loyalty standing beside grief the only way dogs knew how. Ethan still thought about that day often, especially at night when rain tapped softly against the windows and memory drifted through the house like old smoke. But now when those memories came, he no longer carried them alone. Ash slept near the couch every evening beneath the warm glow of the heater, with Viper's old water bowl resting nearby. Some nights the shepherd still dreamed hard enough to twitch or whimper softly in his sleep. Whenever that happened, Ethan simply rested a hand against his fur until the trembling stopped. No words needed. Healing rarely arrived loudly. It came through quiet things repeated gently enough that frightened souls eventually believed them. A soft knock sounded at the front door just after sunrise. Ash lifted his head immediately, but did not bark. Ethan opened the door to find Mia, standing on the porch beside her mother wrapped in a bright yellow scarf almost too large for her small frame. The little girl grinned the second she saw Ash. "I drew something for him," she announced proudly. Ethan stepped aside with a smile. "Come in then." The house filled quickly with warmth and the smell of takeaway pastries while Mia spread colored pencils across the kitchen table. Ash lay patiently beside her chair, allowing the little girl to drape a knitted blue ribbon loosely around his neck while she concentrated fiercely on her drawing. Ethan watched quietly from the sink, while Mia carefully colored a picture of a German shepherd standing beside a tall man beneath falling rain. Childish lines. Uneven colors. But somehow perfect anyway. "That's you," she explained, pointing toward the drawing of Ethan's tattooed arm. "And that is Ash protecting everybody." Ethan looked down at the picture longer than he expected to. Something tightened gently in his throat. Not pain this time. Gratitude. Mia eventually finished coloring and held the page proudly toward Ash. The shepherd studied it with solemn amber eyes before resting his chin lightly against her knee. The little girl giggled softly. "I think he likes it." Outside, sunlight finally broke through the clouds and spilled gold across the backyard grass, still wet from dawn dew. Ethan carried 2 mugs of coffee onto the back steps later that morning while Ash stretched beneath the warmth beside him. The river breeze smelled faintly of eucalyptus and fresh rain. Drifting through the neighborhood. Somewhere nearby, children laughed in a park. Ordinary sounds. beautiful because they were ordinary. Ethan looked down at the shepherd lying peacefully at his feet. "You know," he murmured quietly, "they all thought you were dangerous." Ash opened one eye briefly at the sound of his voice. Ethan smiled faintly into his coffee. "Turns out you were just the only one paying attention." The shepherd rested his head back onto his paws with a long, contented sigh. Sunlight touched the old scars along his muzzle now, softening them into something less like damage and more like proof of survival. Ethan leaned back against the weathered timber railing and listened to the quiet rhythm of the morning around them. No sirens, no storms, no ghosts hiding beneath freight yards or behind gray raincoats anymore. Just a tired handler, a loyal dog, and a small, peaceful life neither of them thought they deserved until they found each other. Sometimes the world calls wounded souls broken because it cannot understand what they survived. But loyalty remembers what time tries to bury. And every now and then, if grace is kind enough, two lost souls find each other at exactly the moment they are both ready to come home.